A silent barber, a chair that listens to secrets and a past that returns in the rain. When three men cross the threshold of the Golden Razor, they don't know they aren't entering a barbershop, but a lesson. Before we begin, like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. In a cobblestone street in the historic center of Santa Fe, where colonial buildings rose with their warm-colored facades and wrought iron balconies, there was a barbershop that seemed to exist in its own time. The Golden Razor, as it was called, on a discreet and somewhat worn sign, was little more than a forgotten spot on the tourist map of the city. Foreign visitors rarely noticed its existence, preferring the picturesque cafes and art galleries that had turned Santa Fe into an international destination. Alexander Walker, the owner, was a man in his 50s with dark eyes that seemed to contain stories no one dared to ask about. His hands, steady as steel when holding the razor, showed small scars that contrasted with his neat and meticulous appearance. He invariably dressed in an impeccable white shirt, black pants and a traditional vest, as if each day were a formal occasion. The barbershop itself was a sanctuary of tradition. Worn but well-maintained leather chairs, mirrors framed in carved wood, and an antique radio that always played melancholic jazz or traditional folk songs. The aroma of aftershave, polished wood, and freshly made coffee created an atmosphere that transported clients to another era. For the few locals who frequented the place, Alexander was simply Mr. Alex, a skilled barber who rarely spoke more than necessary. His cuts were precise, his shaves legendary for their smoothness, and his discretion absolute. The important men of Santa Fe, from politicians to businessmen, preferred his chair to any modern salon, not only for his impeccable technique, but because at the Golden Razor, conversations died within those walls. A good barber is like a good confessor, Mr. Alexander would say with a barely perceptible smile. He listens much and speaks little. What none of his clients knew was that this philosophy didn't come from the traditional wisdom of the trade. Years ago, Alexander Walker had been recruited by International Global Security, a private company that operated in conflict zones around the world. His specialty wasn't in combat or protection, but in something more subtle and powerful: emotional intelligence applied to extreme situations. He was a negotiator, a specialist in reading micro-expressions, a man capable of psychologically destabilizing an adversary without raising his voice or showing physical aggression. That chapter of his life had ended 10 years ago when he decided he had seen enough. He settled in Santa Fe, bought the barbershop from an old man who was retiring, and began a discreet life, away from the constant adrenaline and sleepless nights in countries whose names many Americans couldn't even locate on a map. The afternoon when everything changed was typical of the rainy season. A persistent drizzle fell on the deserted streets, and tourists took refuge in cafes and restaurants. The barbershop was empty, as was often the case on Tuesdays. Alexander meticulously cleaned his tools while listening to Johnny Cash lament about lost loves on the old radio. The tinkling of the doorbell took him out of his routine. Three men entered, shaking water from their jackets. Alexander observed them through the mirror while continuing to polish his favorite razor. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he greeted calmly. "How may I serve you?" The tallest of them, a young man of about 30 with a scar over his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "We're here for a quick cut, master. All three of us." "Of course," Alexander responded, indicating the waiting area with an elegant gesture. "Who will be first?" The three exchanged glances. The shortest, stocky and with an ostentatious gold chain, closed the door and turned the lock. The third, thin and with a nervous look, pretended to examine the products on the shelf. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," said the one with the scar, changing his friendly tone to a more direct one. "We're not really here for a haircut." Alexander continued cleaning his instruments as if he hadn't noticed the change in atmosphere. "May I ask then, to what do I owe the honor of your visit?" "Look, Mr. What did you say your name was?" "Alexander Walker, at your service." "Mr. Alexander," the man continued, approaching the counter, "we've been told that you keep a good amount of cash here. You know, important clients, generous tips. We want to avoid complications." As he spoke, the stocky man began to search through the drawers, and the thin one took out his phone to watch the street through the window. Alexander placed his razor on a red velvet cloth and looked directly at the leader. With an almost imperceptible movement, his left hand pressed a small button hidden under the counter. "I understand perfectly," he said in a serene voice, "but I'm afraid you've been misinformed. I'm a simple barber." The stocky man let out a laugh as he emptied a drawer onto the floor. "A simple barber with these security systems. The main door has an electrical mechanism I've never seen before, and these walls, they're soundproofed, aren't they? That's not normal for a barbershop." Alexander maintained his neutral expression, but internally he was surprised. The man was more observant than he appeared. "The privacy of my clients is important," he responded simply. "Some are businessmen who discuss confidential matters while getting groomed." Of course," the leader intervened, walking around the place as if appraising it for purchase. "Then you won't mind if we look a bit more thoroughly, right? If there's nothing to hide." "Go ahead," Alexander conceded, taking a seat in one of the barber chairs. "But I would suggest you reconsider. You still have time to leave and forget this incident." The three men exchanged glances again, this time with a confident smile. They didn't know that while they were talking, the electronic locks that Alexander had installed years ago as a precaution were already activated. No one would enter or leave without his authorization. The leader approached Alexander, leaning slightly to reach his height. "Are you threatening us, old man? Because that wouldn't be smart." Alexander held his gaze without blinking. "I don't threaten, sir. I only offer options." It was then that the lights flickered, a programmed effect of the security system. The radio changed stations by itself, now emitting a disturbing static. One of the ceiling bulbs exploded with a snap, plunging part of the place into shadows. "What the hell?" muttered the thin man, moving away from the window. "Must be the storm," Alexander commented naturally. "Happens often in this part of the city. The buildings are old, the wiring too." But the three men no longer seemed so sure. The atmosphere had subtly changed. The static from the radio created an unsettling, almost claustrophobic feeling. The mirrors, strategically placed, reflected their figures from unexpected angles. "So," Alexander continued, reclining in the chair with his hands interlaced on his lap, "who exactly sent you? Because I doubt you chose my establishment at random." The leader frowned. "Nobody sent us. We heard rumors, that's all." "Rumors?" Alexander smiled slightly. "Interesting. And from whom exactly?" "That doesn't matter," interrupted the stocky man, who was still searching through the cabinets. "Where's the money, old man?" "Eddie," the leader reprimanded him, "show more respect." Alexander registered the name in his memory. "Eddie," he repeated in a measured voice. "And you are—" "That's none of your business," the leader cut in, clearly annoyed by his companion's slip. "Come now, we're having a civilized conversation," Alexander insisted. "If we're going to spend time together, we should introduce ourselves properly." The three men looked at each other, disconcerted by the barber's calmness. He showed no fear, not even concern. It was as if he were directing the situation exactly where he wanted it to go. "My name is Rick," the leader finally said, perhaps thinking that playing along would give him some advantage. "And he's Charlie," he added, pointing to the thin man, who now seemed increasingly nervous. "Rick, Eddie, and Charlie," Alexander repeated, as if memorizing the names for a reservation. "Good. Now what if we sit down and discuss the situation like reasonable adults?" "There's nothing to discuss," Rick replied, losing patience. "We want the money. Now." Alexander rose slowly from the chair and walked toward the radio, adjusting the dial to reduce the static. The movement was deliberate, designed to show control over the environment. "In my experience," he said as he precisely turned the knobs, "when three men enter an establishment like this, there's usually more at stake than a simple improvised robbery. Someone sent you, someone who perhaps told you it would be easy, that I was just an old barber." The light flickered again, this time more intensely. In the momentary darkness, Alexander moved silently until he was behind Charlie, the most nervous of the three. When the light stabilized, Charlie jumped to find him so close. "I'd like to know who told you about me," Alexander continued, his voice now softer but equally penetrating. Because whoever did exposed you to unnecessary risk, and that doesn't speak well of someone who supposedly cares about you. Eddie stopped rummaging through the drawers and looked at Rick with uncertainty. Something in the way the barber spoke was beginning to disturb them. They weren't direct threats, but insinuations that sowed doubts among them. "What do you mean?" asked Charlie, his voice barely audible above the static. "I mean," Alexander replied, now walking with measured steps around the three, "that someone sent you here knowing perfectly well that I am not what I appear to be. And that makes me wonder why that person would want to expose you this way." Charlie exchanged a nervous look with Rick. The barber's unshakable calm contrasted with the growing tension that seized them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rick replied, trying to regain control of the situation. "Nobody sent us, we just heard there's easy money here." Alexander nodded slowly, like a patient teacher facing an incorrect answer. "Interesting theory," he said, slightly adjusting the volume of the radio. The static decreased, replaced by an almost hypnotic piano melody. "But I have another perspective. Would you like to hear it?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "I believe someone specifically told you about me. Someone who knows my past, or at least thinks they do, and they sent you here not to succeed but to send me a message." Eddie had abandoned his search and was now watching the barber with growing unease. Something in the way that man moved, in how he controlled the space around him, revealed training that went far beyond cutting hair. "Who the hell are you, really?" Eddie asked. Alexander smiled sadly. "A man who exchanged storms for calm, Eddie. Nothing more." Charlie, increasingly nervous, tried to use his phone. "No signal," he murmured. "The building structure," Alexander explained naturally. "Thick walls, old wiring, interferes with mobile signals, an inconvenience for modern clients, but the regulars like the disconnect." Rick didn't seem convinced. He tried to open the main door only to discover it was locked. "What does this mean?" he demanded, pulling forcefully on the handle. "Open it right now." "I'm afraid there's a problem with the lock," Alexander replied unperturbed. "It happens during storms. The electrical system becomes erratic." "Liar!" Rick shouted, hitting the door with his fist. "You've locked us in." Alexander remained impassive at the outburst. "Please, sit down. If we're temporarily trapped by a technical failure, we might as well make use of the time." His tone brooked no argument. It was a suggestion formulated as a veiled order. The three men, disconcerted by the turn the situation had taken, exchanged looks of uncertainty. "And what do you propose we do?" Rick asked sarcastically, finally abandoning his attempts to open the door. "Converse," Alexander replied simply. "Get to know each other better." Charlie let out a nervous laugh. "You want to chat with the guys who came to rob you?" "I prefer to think of you as unexpected guests," corrected Alexander, heading towards a small cabinet in the back of the barbershop. From it, he extracted a bottle of aged whiskey and 5 small glasses. "Would you care for some? It's Macallan, an excellent aged Scotch." The incongruity of the situation further destabilized the intruders. A man they had come to threaten was offering them premium whiskey as if they were lifelong friends. "We don't drink on duty," Rick responded automatically. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "On duty?" Interesting choice of words for someone who simply heard rumors about a barbershop. The slip didn't go unnoticed. Charlie looked at Rick reproachfully while Eddie cursed under his breath. "What Rick means," Charlie tried to explain. "What Rick means," interrupted Alexander, pouring a glass of whiskey for himself, "is that you have orders, a mission, and drinking during a mission is unprofessional." He took a sip of whiskey, savoring it before continuing. "The question is, who gives those orders? And why would they send you, clearly novices in this type of operation, to confront someone like me?" The light flickered again, this time accompanied by a distant thunder. In that brief instant of darkness, Alexander strategically moved one of the mirrors, altering the perception of space. When the light returned, Charlie jumped. He could have sworn the barber was on the other side of the room, but now he was next to him, barely a meter away. "This barbershop," Alexander commented as he ran his fingers along the edge of the newly moved mirror. I designed it specifically to create certain effects. The arrangement of mirrors, the acoustics, the lighting, everything has a purpose." "What purpose?" asked Eddie, his voice betraying growing fear. "Comfort for my regular clients," Alexander replied. "And environmental control for extraordinary situations." Rick approached him with a defiant attitude. "Stop playing with us. Who the hell are you?" Alexander studied him in silence for a moment, analyzing his micro-expressions, the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. Then, with a fluid movement, he went to a small desk in the corner and extracted a framed photograph. 15 years ago, he said as he showed them the image, "I was part of a specialized team, had international global security. We worked in conflict zones, handling delicate situations that required psychological tact." The photograph showed a younger Alexander, dressed in discreet tactical clothing, alongside 4 other men. In the background, an arid landscape could be distinguished that could be from any conflict zone in the Middle East. Charlie studied the image carefully, and then looked at the barber with an expression of horrified recognition. "I've seen you before," he murmured. "In a video, years ago. You are the negotiator." Alexander slightly inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying. But his gaze intensified, studying Charlie with renewed interest. "The negotiator?" Eddie repeated, confused. "What is this idiot talking about?" Charlie swallowed, his face paler than before. "There was a leaked video years ago. An interrogation somewhere in the desert. You couldn't see faces clearly, but there was a man who never raised his voice, never touched the subjects, and yet he got what he was looking for," completed Alexander softly. "Interesting that you know about that material, Charlie. It's not something easily found on the internet." Rick looked at Charlie with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Your friend seems to have access to classified information," explained Alexander, observing the growing tension between the 3 men. Which raises another interesting question. Who is Charlie really? "It's just a damn video," Charlie defended himself, backing up until he hit one of the walls. "I saw it years ago when I was studying, when I was interested in behavioral psychology." "Psychology?" Eddie let out a nervous laugh. You barely finished high school." Alexander observed the exchange with professional interest. The cracks in their relationship were beginning to appear, exactly as he had foreseen. Distrust, carefully sown, flourished before his eyes. "Gentlemen," he intervened in a measured voice, "we're getting sidetracked. The important thing here is not my past, but your present. You're trapped in a potentially dangerous situation, sent by someone who clearly didn't value your lives enough." "Nobody sent us," Rick insisted, but his voice lacked the previous conviction. "Of course," Alexander conceded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It was mere coincidence that you chose my establishment on a day with few clients, during a storm that affects electrical systems. All perfectly casual." The irony in his voice was palpable. Eddie and Charlie exchanged uneasy glances, while Rick maintained an increasingly fragile facade of composure. "What intrigues me," Alexander continued, pouring himself another small glass of whiskey, "is why someone would want to test me after so many years. I've kept a low profile. I retired from the business a decade ago. Santa Fe should have been a quiet sanctuary." "Maybe you weren't as discreet as you thought," suggested Rick, regaining some of his confidence as the conversation moved away from them. Alexander considered this for a moment. It's possible. Or perhaps someone from the past has decided to revive old stories. He approached the window, watching the rain that now fell more forcefully. The streets were completely deserted. "I propose a deal," he finally said, turning to the 3 men. "Tell me who sent you and I'll let you leave without complications. I'll even give you some money so you don't return empty-handed." "And if we don't?" Rick challenged. Alexander's smile became enigmatic. "Then we'll have to explore other options. Less pleasant for everyone." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of rain against the glass and the distant melody from the radio. The 3 men looked at each other, evaluating their possibilities. The situation had changed dramatically since they entered the barbershop with such confidence. We can't trust him, Eddie muttered to Rick. He's one of them, the ones who make people disappear. I don't make anyone disappear, Alexander corrected, his trained ear easily catching the whisper. That was never my specialty. I simply persuade. The way he pronounced the last word sent a chill down Charlie's spine, who remembered fragments of the infamous video. Tough men, trained to resist, reduced to trembling masses just with words and environmental manipulation. Give him what he wants, Charlie pleaded to Rick. This guy isn't a simple barber. Shut up, Rick snapped, but his authority was visibly crumbling. We're not saying anything. Alexander sighed, like a disappointed teacher with obstinate students. Very well. I respect your loyalty, although it's misplaced. Let's move on to Plan B then. He went to a cabinet in the back and extracted a small polished wooden box. Upon opening it, he revealed a set of antique barber tools, beautifully preserved. My grandfather was a barber in Portland, he commented as he caressed the pieces with reverence. He taught me the trade when I was a child. He always said that a well-sharpened razor could tell stories on a man's skin. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed. Eddie took a step back, bumping into one of the barber chairs. It doesn't have to be this way, said Alexander, taking out a particularly elegant razor from the box. Physical violence is primitive, unnecessary when one has other skills. He opened the razor with a fluid movement that denoted years of practice. The blade caught the reflection of the lights, sending flashes throughout the room. Do you know what I learned during my years at IGS? He asked, examining the edge of the razor against the light. That fear of the unknown is more powerful than any concrete threat. Uncertainty destabilizes even the strongest minds. He moved with feline grace around the three men, the razor in his hand like a natural extension of his arm. For example, he continued, you don't know what I plan to do with this. It could be a simple theatrical prop to intimidate you, or it could have more practical uses. The three men followed his movements with their eyes, hypnotized by the combination of his calm voice and the implicit threat of the shining blade. The human mind always imagines the worst possible scenario, Alexander proceeded. It's a survival mechanism. Right now, your minds are creating terrible images, much worse than anything I could actually do. He stopped in front of Eddie, who held his breath as the razor passed centimeters from his face. What are you imagining right now, Eddie? He asked softly. What do you think a man with my training could do in a situation like this? Eddie couldn't answer. His face reflected a primary instinctive terror. Exactly, Alexander nodded. Your imagination is my best ally at this moment. He moved away with the same fluidity with which he had approached, closing the razor with a precise movement. But there's something you should understand, he said as he put the razor back in its case. I'm not the man I was before. I left that world because I grew tired of the darkness. This barbershop is my redemption, my attempt to live in peace. The rain pounded against the windows, creating a perfect backdrop for the tension that dominated the interior of the golden razor. The three intruders remained motionless, processing Alexander's words, evaluating their meaning and the implications of their current situation. Charlie was the first to break the silence. If you really seek peace, why have you locked us in here? Why not simply call the police? Alexander looked at him with renewed interest. There was intelligence in that question, more than he expected from a simple thief. The police would ask questions, he responded after a pause. About you, about me, about this barbershop. Questions that could awaken ghosts I prefer to keep dormant. Besides, he added with an enigmatic smile, I believe in second chances. Second chances? Eddie let out an incredulous laugh. You're threatening us with a razor. I showed you a razor, Alexander corrected. There's a subtle but significant difference. At no point have I directly threatened you. He went to the main barber chair and sat down, indicating the available seats with an elegant gesture. I offer you a clean way out of this situation, he continued. Tell me who sent you, and you can leave as if nothing had happened. Consider it as an investment in your future. Rick maintained his defiant gaze, but something in his posture had changed. He no longer projected his initial confidence. He looked at his companions, evaluating their reactions. Eddie seemed anxious, ready to yield. Charlie, for his part, maintained an indecipherable expression. "Nobody sent us," Rick insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Alexander let out a sigh. "Loyalty is admirable, Rick, but it must be directed at those who deserve it. Do you really believe the person who sent you here cares about your well-being?" An uncomfortable silence followed his words. Doubt was clearly reflected in the faces of Eddie and Charlie. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rick replied, crossing his arms. "Well, I think you do know," Charlie unexpectedly intervened. "I think you know exactly what he's talking about." Everyone turned to him, surprised by his sudden participation. "Charlie," Rick warned in a threatening tone. "No, Rick," Charlie replied, straightening up. "This has gone too far. It wasn't what you told me we would do." Alexander observed the exchange with professional interest, like a scientist studying a chemical reaction in development. "And what did he tell you exactly?" he asked softly. Charlie looked at Rick, then at Eddie, and finally at the barber. "He said it would be easy. A defenseless old man, easy money, no complications. He didn't mention anything about who you really are." "Shut your mouth, you idiot," Rick shouted, taking a step toward Charlie. "Why?" Charlie responded, surprisingly firm. "To protect Jason, after what he's done to us?" Alexander immediately registered the new name. "Jason," he repeated, "an interesting name." Rick glared at Charlie. "I'm going to—" "No, you won't," interrupted Alexander with a voice that, without rising, dominated the room. "You won't do anything except sit down and listen." His tone brooked no argument. Rick, despite his evident fury, backed down and dropped into one of the waiting chairs. "Jason Miller," continued Charlie, ignoring Rick's murderous looks. "He's the one who sent us." "Charlie, this is treason," Eddie murmured. "Treason?" Charlie let out a bitter laugh. "To whom do we owe loyalty, Eddie? To Jason, who sent us here as cannon fodder, or to ourselves? His brother will kill us for this," Eddie insisted, looking at Rick. "Brother?" asked Alexander, putting the pieces together. "Jason is your brother, Rick?" Rick remained silent, but his expression said it all. "Now I understand," said Alexander, reclining in his chair. "A family matter. Those are always the most complicated." He rose with deliberately slow movements and approached the window. The rain had decreased, but the sky was still dark and threatening. "What relationship do you have with Jason Miller?" he asked Rick directly. Faced with Rick's obstinate silence, it was Charlie who responded. "He doesn't have any, at least not directly. Jason heard stories about Alexander's past, about his special abilities. He wants to recruit him for his organization." "Recruit me?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised for the first time since the incident began. "And sending 3 men to assault me seemed like the best recruitment strategy to him." "It wasn't really an assault," explained Charlie, ignoring Rick's furious look. "It was a test. Jason wanted to see if the rumors about your abilities were true. So I'm a lab rat in an experiment," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Interesting approach." "Jason isn't someone who accepts no for an answer," continued Charlie. "He has methods to get what he wants." "And you know them well, don't you?" Eddie intervened, his voice laden with bitterness. "How long have you been working for him behind our backs, Charlie?" The question fell like a bomb in the room. Rick, who until then had been sunk in furious silence, suddenly sat up straight. "What the hell is he talking about?" he demanded of Charlie. Charlie visibly paled. "I don't know what he's talking about." "Oh, I think you do know," Eddie insisted. "I've seen you meet with him alone. I always thought you were planning some minor business, but now I understand." Alexander observed the exchange with clinical fascination. The cracks between the 3 men were widening by themselves without needing his intervention. "You're a damn informant," Rick accused, advancing toward Charlie. "My own brother put you to watch me." "It's not what you think," Charlie defended himself, backing up until he hit the counter. "Jason just wanted to make sure you were okay, that you didn't make mistakes." "Mistakes?" Rick's voice trembled with fury. "Like what? Like thinking for myself, like trying to build something of my own outside his shadow?" Alexander intervened softly. "It seems your brother has a strong desire for control, Rick." Rick looked at him, momentarily disconcerted by the observation, before turning his attention back to Charlie. "Since when? Since when have you been his lapdog?" Charlie swallowed, trapped between Rick's fury and Alexander's unsettling calm. "6 months, he finally confessed, "since you started talking about becoming independent. And this job, this test, was that Jason's idea too?" "It was complicated," Charlie replied, choosing his words carefully. "Jason wanted to test Mr. Walker, see if he really had the abilities attributed to him, but he also wanted to test you." "Me?" Rick seemed genuinely confused. "Your loyalty, your ability to follow orders," Charlie explained. "He's worried about your ambitions. He thinks you could become competition." Eddie let out a bitter laugh. "All this time thinking we were partners, when we were just pawns on the Miller brothers' chessboard." "I didn't intend for things to go this far," Charlie insisted. "It was supposed to be something simple. Go in, scare the old man a little, see how he reacted, and leave." "But you didn't count on the old man having his own resources," Alexander commented, reinserting himself into the conversation. "An understandable miscalculation." Rick dropped heavily into a chair, the very image of defeat. "All this time," he murmured, "believing he finally respected me as an equal." "Older brothers rarely see younger ones as equals," Alexander observed with a softness that contrasted with the harshness of his words. "It's a dynamic as old as humanity itself." He approached Rick and, surprisingly, offered him a glass of whiskey that the young man accepted with trembling hands. "The real question," Alexander continued, also serving Eddie and Charlie, "is what you'll do with this revelation." "What options do I have?" Rick asked bitterly. "He's my brother. He's family." "Family isn't always what's best for us," Alexander replied, his gaze momentarily lost in his own memories. "Sometimes to grow, we must distance ourselves from those who should protect us." Eddie, who had been silent, intervened. "We can't go back empty-handed. Jason wouldn't allow it." "You don't have to," said Alexander, an idea taking shape in his mind. "You could return with something much more valuable than money." The three looked at him expectantly. "Information," he explained, an enigmatic smile forming on his lips, the most powerful weapon in any negotiation. "What kind of information?" asked Charlie, intrigued despite himself. "The kind that will give you an advantage over Jason," Alexander replied. "The kind that could change the balance of power." Rick looked at him with a mixture of hope and distrust. "Why would you help us? We came to rob you." "Let's say I'm curious," Alexander replied, "about this Jason, about his organization, about why he's so interested in my supposed abilities." He poured himself another glass of whiskey and raised it in a silent toast. "Besides," he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I've never liked seeing a man controlling others through fear. It reminds me too much of what I left behind." The atmosphere inside the Golden Razor had subtly changed. The initial hostility had transformed into an uncomfortable alliance, born of necessity and shared revelations. Alexander observed the three, men as they considered their options, each dealing with his own conclusions. "What kind of information could give us an advantage over Jason?" Rick finally asked, breaking the reflective silence that had settled among them. Alexander rose with deliberate movements and headed toward an apparently ordinary picture hanging on the back wall of the barbershop. He took it down, revealing a small wall safe. "In my previous profession," he explained as he manipulated the combination, "I learned that information must be kept securely, but accessible in case of emergency." The safe door opened with a soft click. From inside, Alexander extracted a worn leather notebook and a small electronic device the size of a music player. "For years," he continued, returning to his seat, "I have kept records of certain interesting conversations that have taken place in this barbershop." "You've been recording your clients?" asked Charlie, visibly surprised. "Only those who say things that deserve to be remembered," Alexander replied with an enigmatic smile. Santa Fe may seem like a quiet colonial town for tourists, but it's surprising the amount of valuable information that circulates in its streets. He opened the notebook and turned some pages. occasionally stopping to read annotations written in a kind of personal code. Jason Miller, he murmured, as if savoring the name, a name that has appeared in recent conversations, an ambitious businessman with political connections and a growing influence in the real estate sector of New Mexico. Rick nodded, surprised by the accuracy of the description. Properties are his official business, yes, but his true interests are more diverse. Smuggling, Eddie added in a low voice, mainly antiquities and works of art. Interesting, Alexander commented, making a note in his notebook. The black market for American antiquities is extremely lucrative, especially with international buyers willing to pay fortunes for pre-colonial pieces. It's not just that, Charlie intervened, earning a warning look from Rick that he decided to ignore. He's also expanding into protection. He offers security to businesses in Santa Fe and nearby cities. Extortion disguised as service, Alexander translated. A classic. He closed the notebook and looked at them with renewed intensity. What intrigues me is why a man like him with a growing empire would be interested in my services, especially considering I've been retired for a decade. He has problems, Rick explained after a moment of doubt. With a rival group from Albuquerque that's invading his territory, they've been persistent. And Jason believes my persuasion skills could be useful to him in this territorial dispute, Alexander concluded. It wasn't a question. Exactly, Rick confirmed. He's heard stories about how you could convince people without resorting to physical violence. He says that has style class. Alexander let out a short, almost bitter laugh. It has always fascinated me how they romanticize my work, as if psychologically destabilizing a human being was somehow more elegant than physical violence. He rose again and approached the electronic device he had left on the counter. He activated it with a button, and a small green light began to blink. In reality, he continued, my job consisted of finding cracks in people's minds, insecurities, fears, traumas, and then exploiting them until I got what I was looking for. There's nothing elegant about it. The frankness of his confession created an uncomfortable silence. The three men observed him with a mixture of fascination and renewed fear. And what exactly do you propose? Charlie finally asked. What information could help us against Jason? Alexander smiled, this time with genuine satisfaction. I propose a three-part plan. First, information about Jason's operations that he believes no one knows about. Second, strategic contacts that could provide you protection. And third, a lesson on how to handle people like Jason. He activated the small device, which projected a bluish light onto the wall. Within that beam, holographic data appeared. Names, dates, locations, technology from my former employer, he explained to their surprised looks. Modified for my personal purposes. The data showed a complex network of connections between various names, some of which Rick and his companions immediately recognized. These are all Jason's partners, Rick murmured, studying the diagram with amazement. And these, Alexander pointed to several specific points, are his weak spots. People who pretend loyalty, but are willing to betray him for the right price. Operations vulnerable to official inspections. Bank accounts that wouldn't withstand detailed scrutiny. Eddie whistled under his breath. How did you get all this? Information. People talk in the barbershop, Alexander replied simply, especially when they believe the barber is just a harmless old man who barely understands complicated business. He turned to Rick. Your brother has made the mistake that many powerful men make, underestimating those he considers inferior. It's a mistake you shouldn't repeat. Rick nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson along with the information projected before him. But this isn't enough, Alexander continued, turning off the device. Information is power, yes, but only if you know how to use it. And that's where the third part of my proposal comes in. I'll teach you how to handle Jason, how to use his own tactics against him. He went to his barber chair and sat down, observing. Then with the intensity of a master evaluating potential students, the question is, are you willing to learn? Because what I'm proposing isn't a shortcut. It's a difficult path that will require patience, intelligence, and discipline. The three exchanged glances. Alexander's proposal was tempting but also dangerous. Challenging Jason Miller wasn't something to be taken lightly. "If we fail," Eddie warned, "we're finished. Jason doesn't forgive betrayal." "You won't fail." "If you follow my instructions to the letter," Alexander replied with absolute confidence. "I've handled much more complicated situations than a narcissist with a superiority complex." Rick stood up and began to walk around the barbershop, evaluating his options. On one hand, the opportunity to free himself from his brother's control was more tempting than he would ever admit out loud. On the other, the consequences of failure were too serious to ignore. "Why would you help us?" he finally asked, stopping in front of Alexander. "What do you gain from all this?" The question hung in the air, loaded with justified distrust. Alexander considered it for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal of his true motivations. "Let's say I have my reasons," he finally replied. "Some practical, some personal." He rose and approached the window. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a clear sky and fresh air that filtered through the cracks. "In my years as a negotiator," he continued, his voice tinged with bitter nostalgia, "I saw too many men like Jason. Men who build empires on fear and intimidation, who use others as disposable tools." He turned to them and for the first time revealed a spark of real emotion in his habitually controlled gaze. "When I retired, I swore I would never be part of that world again. But I also didn't promise to stand by with folded arms when that world comes looking for me." Charlie nodded, understanding the subtle but significant distinction. "Besides," Alexander added with a sardonic smile, "your brother has committed the discourtesy of sending thugs to my business. That deserves at minimum an educational response." Rick couldn't help but smile at the comment. There was something refreshing about Alexander's direct honesty, so different from Jason's constant manipulations. "What's the exact plan?" he asked, implicitly making the decision for the group. Alexander nodded with approval at the direct question. "First phase. You'll return to Jason and tell him exactly what he expects to hear. That you found me, that I was just as the rumors said, and that I'm interested in a meeting to discuss possible collaborations." "And if he wants to meet immediately," asked Eddie, "you'll tell him I need time to close some pending matters. 1 week, no more, no less." "What will we do during that week?" inquired Charlie. Alexander's smile became as sharp as one of his razors. "Prepare the stage for his fall. We'll contact certain people who have their own pending accounts with Jason. We'll gather evidence of his less legal activities. And most importantly, I'll teach you to use the techniques that Jason so desires against himself." He approached a small cabinet and extracted 3 identical cards with a printed phone number. "This number will connect you directly to me. Use it only in case of absolute emergency, and then destroy the card." He handed them the cards and then extracted a small flask from his pocket. It contained a clear liquid that he poured into 3 clean glasses. "Drink this," he indicated. The 3 looked at him with evident distrust. "It's not poison," he clarified with an amused smile. "It's simply water with a special compound that will leave detectable traces in your blood for 72 hours. If Jason, as I suspect, has ways to verify if you're telling the truth, any analysis will confirm that you were exposed to chemicals in my barbershop." "Chemicals for what?" asked Eddie, wary. "To support the story you'll tell him. That I tried to resist at first, that I used some of my old tricks, but that you finally saw my potential and convinced me of the opportunity that working with Jason represents." Rick took one of the glasses and examined it against the light. "And this won't harm us?" "Not at all. It metabolizes completely in 3 days and leaves no side effects. It's advanced technology developed for covert operations." The 3 drank the liquid, which had no perceptible taste. Alexander collected the empty glasses and cleaned them meticulously. "One last thing," he said, as he headed toward the main door and deactivated the security system with a discreet command. "For this to work, we need Jason to trust you absolutely. That means you must return with something valuable for him." He extracted a small USB device from his pocket and handed it to Rick. "Here is information about some of my old techniques. Nothing compromising for me, but interesting enough for Jason to believe you've been successful in your mission." "And if he wants more?" asked Rick, pocketing the device. "You'll tell him I'll discuss the rest personally during our meeting," Alexander replied. "Men like Jason always want to feel they're the ones who close big deals." He opened the door of the barbershop. The fresh air of the post-rain afternoon flooded the place, bringing with it the aroma of wet earth and the distant sound of music that began to emerge from nearby bars and restaurants. "1 week, gentlemen," Alexander reminded as the 3 men prepared to leave. "I'll be waiting for your call with the exact date and time for the meeting. 7 days can seem like an eternity, or a breath, depending on perspective." For Rick, Eddie, and Charlie, the week passed in a state of constant tension and meticulous preparation. Under Alexander's guidance, they learned the fundamentals of what he called strategic persuasion, the art of reading micro-expressions, identifying behavior patterns, and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities without ever resorting to direct threat. Meanwhile, through his extensive network of contacts cultivated over years as the discreet barber of Santa Fe, Alexander had been moving invisible pieces on a board that Jason Miller didn't even know existed. The night before the scheduled meeting, Alexander received the 3 men in his barbershop for final preparations. The place, temporarily transformed into a strategy room, displayed maps of Jason's mansion on the outskirts of Santa Fe and detailed diagrams of his antiquities operation. "Let's review the plan one last time," said Alexander, pointing to the document spread over the central table that normally held magazines and newspapers for waiting clients. "I'll be waiting in Jason's study," Rick began, reciting his part of the plan. "I'll confirm that you've arrived and that everything is according to plan." "Eddie will watch the main entrance," continued Charlie, "making sure none of the guards interfere during the meeting. And you, Charlie, will take care of the technology." Alexander completed with a gesture of approval. "You'll temporarily deactivate the security cameras in the study using the device I provided you." The 3 nodded, mentally reviewing their respective responsibilities. "Remember," Alexander continued, "the most important thing is to remain calm. Jason will be looking for any sign of betrayal or nervousness. His trust in you is fundamental for this to work. And if he suspects something," asked Eddie, always the most cautious of the group. "If you follow the plan exactly as we've discussed, he'll have no reason to suspect," Alexander replied. "But if something unexpected arises, trust your training. I've taught you the essentials in these days. Trust your instinct and adapt the strategy as necessary." Rick studied Alexander's serene face, looking for any sign of doubt or concern. He found none. "Do you really believe it will work?" he finally asked. "That we can confront Jason on his own turf and come out victorious?" Alexander looked at him directly, with an intensity that recalled the man he had been before becoming a barber. "It's not about confrontation," he gently corrected. "It's about redirection. Like in martial arts, using the opponent's force against himself. Jason believes he's drawing me into his world, when in reality, he's entering mine." His words, pronounced with absolute conviction, conveyed a certainty that the 3 men desperately needed. "One last thing," Alexander added, handing them small devices the size of buttons. "Put these on your shirt collars. They're high-tech microphones. I'll be able to hear everything that happens and, if necessary, give you instructions through these almost invisible earpieces." He gave them 3 small devices that fit perfectly into the ear canal. "Remember," he concluded, "we're not looking to destroy Jason. We just want to rebalance power, give you the freedom you deserve." Jason Miller's mansion, situated in the hills surrounding Santa Fe, was a perfect blend of Southwestern architecture and modern luxuries. From the outside, it looked like a traditional adobe house. Inside, it was a monument to opulence and power. Cutting-edge security systems were hidden behind adobe facades and ancient tiles. Discreet cameras watched every corner of the property. The day of the meeting dawned clear, with that intensely blue sky so characteristic of the New Mexico desert. Alexander arrived punctually at 11 in the morning, driving a modest Volkswagen that contrasted with the luxury vehicles parked at the entrance. He wore an impeccable gray suit, conservative but elegant, more fitting for a respectable lawyer than a neighborhood barber. As planned, Eddie received him at the main door, escorting him through hallways decorated with Native American artifacts of incalculable value, pieces that Alexander knew had been acquired on the black market. "Mr. Miller is waiting for you in his study," Eddie announced with rehearsed formality, perfectly playing his part. Jason's study was exactly as Alexander had imagined. A spacious room with oak shelves full of never-read books, a massive mahogany desk, and large windows offering panoramic views of the colonial city below. The type of space designed not for work, but to impress. Jason Miller rose upon seeing him enter. He was an attractive man in his 40s, with the kind of perpetual tan that only money can maintain. His black hair, perfectly combed back, was beginning to show strategic gray at the temples, which added an air of gravitas to his appearance. "Mr. Walker," he greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you." Alexander shook his hand with precise firmness, neither too strong nor too weak. "Mr. Miller, the pleasure is mine." Rick, as agreed, was present in a corner of the study, observing the encounter with a neutral expression. Charlie, according to the plan, would have already deactivated the security cameras. "Please have a seat," Jason invited, indicating a leather armchair in front of his desk. "Can I offer you something to drink? I have an exceptional cognac that I just brought from France." "Water will be fine, thank you," Alexander replied. "I never mix alcohol and business." Jason nodded with approval, as if he had passed some preliminary test. He served water for Alexander and cognac for himself, taking his time, a man accustomed to others waiting for him. "I must admit," Jason began, sitting behind his desk, "I was skeptical when my men told me about you. A retired barber with special skills. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it?" "Sometimes the best way to disappear is in plain sight," Alexander replied simply. "A barbershop offers privacy, conversations, and busy hands. Perfect for someone seeking a quiet life." Jason studied him with genuine curiosity. "And why would someone with your talents seek a quiet life? The world needs men with special skills." Alexander smiled slightly. "Perhaps precisely because I have those skills, I understand better than anyone the costs of using them constantly." The answer seemed to intrigue Jason, who took a sip of his cognac while considering his words. "My men told me that you demonstrated impressive capabilities when they visited you. You had them completely under control." "An exaggeration," Alexander replied with calculated modesty. "I simply used some basic techniques of environmental control and behavior reading. Nothing extraordinary." "Nothing extraordinary," Jason repeated with an incredulous smile. "3 of my best men psychologically disarmed in minutes. I would call that quite extraordinary." Alexander maintained his neutral expression, but internally noted the first crack in Jason's facade, the lie about his best men. If he considered Rick, Eddie, and Charlie as the best he had, either he was lying out of pride, or his organization was much less impressive than he pretended. "What interests me," Jason continued, "is how we could apply those skills of yours to certain challenges I currently face." "I'm sure a man in your position faces many challenges," Alexander replied. "Could you be more specific?" Jason seemed to evaluate him for a moment, deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he leaned forward. "I have competition. A group from Albuquerque that doesn't respect traditional territorial boundaries. So far, our exchanges have been relatively contained, but the situation is escalating." "And you would prefer a solution that doesn't involve direct violence," Alexander guessed. "Exactly," Jason confirmed with an approving smile. "Violence is noisy, attracts attention. In my business, discretion is paramount." "Understandable," Alexander nodded. "In my time with IGS, we developed specific protocols for similar situations. Psychological destabilization techniques applied to hierarchical organizations." Jason's eyes shone with barely contained interest. It was exactly the reaction Alexander expected. "Could you elaborate?" Jason asked, trying and failing to maintain a casual tone. "Of course," Alexander replied, leaning slightly forward as if sharing a valuable secret. "The basic principle is simple. Every organization, no matter how strong it seems, has fracture points, questionable loyalties, personal ambitions, compromising secrets. The objective isn't to attack the structure directly, but to identify those weak points and apply precise pressure. Jason listened with almost reverential attention. Alexander continued, his voice a hypnotic instrument of precision. Instead of eliminating a rival, which only creates a vacuum that someone else will eventually fill, it's about recalibrating their priorities, making them see cooperation as more beneficial than conflict. Fascinating, Jason murmured. And these techniques, do they work consistently? When applied correctly, yes, Alexander confirmed. But they require detailed information, adequate time for implementation, and a controlled environment for the critical phases of the operation. Alexander noticed how Jason's eyes momentarily deviated toward a safe hidden behind a painting, exactly where his sources had indicated he kept compromising information about his rivals and partners alike. I have information, Jason offered. Complete files on the Albuquerque operation, their routes, contacts, even some personal details about their leaders. Excellent, Alexander approved. That would considerably accelerate the evaluation process. Jason seemed increasingly enthusiastic, like a collector about to acquire a coveted piece. When could we begin? I could start reviewing that information today, Alexander replied, but before proceeding I must clarify my terms. Jason's expression hardened slightly. He wasn't accustomed to others imposing conditions. Of course, he said with a tense smile. Compensation won't be a problem. I'm extremely generous with those who provide me valuable services. It's not just about economic compensation, Alexander clarified. I have certain principles that have guided my work since always. Lines I don't cross. Such as, Jason asked, studying him with renewed interest. I don't work with information obtained through torture, Alexander replied firmly. It's unreliable and ethically compromising. I don't involve innocent civilians in operations. And I require complete autonomy in implementing my strategies. Reasonable conditions, Jason conceded after briefly considering. I can respect them as long as we get results. And one more condition, Alexander added, briefly looking at Rick. The personnel who work directly with me answer only to me during the operation. No external interference. Jason followed his gaze toward Rick, and an expression of understanding crossed his face. Ah, I see you've already established a certain connection with my brother and his friends. They're promising, Alexander commented. With the right training, they could be truly exceptional. Something changed in Jason's expression. A shadow of suspicion, perhaps even jealousy, briefly crossed his face. My brother has always been impressionable, he said with barely disguised disdain. He constantly seeks figures to replace paternal authority. Or perhaps he simply recognizes the value of genuine respect over imposed fear, Alexander suggested softly. The comment floated in the air like a barely visible razor. Jason stared at him, processing the implication. Interesting observation, he finally replied, especially coming from someone who has just met us. Observing is my specialty, Mr. Miller, Alexander replied with an enigmatic smile. As I told you, every organization has its fracture points. A tense silence settled between them. Jason broke it with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. I like your style, Walker. Direct but subtle. I think we'll work very well together. He rose and headed toward the safe hidden behind the painting, exactly as Alexander had foreseen. The plan was working perfectly. Let me show you the information we have on our friends from Albuquerque, Jason said as he manipulated the combination. I think you'll find it quite complete. While Jason had his back turned, Alexander exchanged a significant look with Rick, who nodded imperceptibly. The safe opened with a soft click. Jason extracted several folders and an external hard drive. Here's everything you need to know, he said, placing the materials on the desk. Alexander examined them with professional interest, immediately noticing that some of the photographs and documents not only compromised Jason's rivals, but also high-profile political and business figures in the region. Impressive, he commented sincerely. May I ask how you obtained this information? I have my methods, Jason replied with barely disguised pride. Contacts in strategic places. Evidently, Alexander nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Do you mind if I review the material more thoroughly before discussing specific strategies? I prefer to form my own conclusions without initial bias." "Of course," Jason conceded magnanimously. "Take your time. My house is your house." "Thank you," Alexander replied. "And to ensure the confidentiality of our subsequent strategic conversation, would it be possible to use a space without electronic surveillance?" Jason raised an eyebrow, momentarily surprised by the request. "The cameras are for security," he explained, "but I suppose we could temporarily deactivate them in this room." "I would appreciate it," said Alexander. "Some of the techniques we'll discuss are extremely sensitive. In my experience, the fewer records that exist, the better for all involved." Jason considered the request for a moment and then nodded. "Charlie," he called through the intercom, "deactivate the cameras in the study." "It's already done, sir," Charlie's voice responded. "I deactivated them when Mr. Walker arrived, as an additional security measure." Jason slightly frowned at this unauthorized initiative, but let it pass. "Well, then we're completely in private," he confirmed, sitting back behind his desk. "Is there anything else you need to begin?" "Just one more thing," Alexander replied, taking a small device from his pocket. He activated it with a discreet button. "A signal inhibitor, professional habit, guarantees that no unauthorized device can be recording our conversation." The device emitted a slight, barely perceptible hum. "Now," Alexander continued, his voice acquiring a different tone, deeper and more resonant, "we can speak with total frankness, Mr. Miller." And it was then that Alexander's true plan began to reveal itself. It wasn't simply about obtaining information or neutralizing Jason. It was about a complete recalibration of power, executed with the surgical precision that had made the negotiator legendary in certain circles. During the next 2 hours, in that room isolated from the outside world, Alexander Walker deployed the complete arsenal of psychological techniques he had perfected during his years at IGS. Without raising his voice or making a single threatening movement, he systematically unraveled the layers of confidence and control that Jason had built around himself. Using only carefully chosen words, strategic silences, and a deep knowledge of human vulnerabilities, Alexander guided Jason toward one revelation after another, about himself, about his relationship with his brother, about the fragile foundations of his empire. It wasn't an interrogation, but a conversation. There was no coercion, only clarity. And when it finally ended, something fundamental had changed in Jason Miller. Upon leaving the study 3 hours later, Alexander met Rick in the hallway. "Did it work?" Rick asked quietly, studying his face for signs. Alexander nodded slightly. "Your brother has reconsidered certain priorities. I think you'll find that his perspective on many things has evolved." "What did you tell him exactly?" "Nothing that wasn't true," Alexander replied enigmatically. "Sometimes the only thing we need to change is to see ourselves clearly." In the following weeks, Santa Fe experienced subtle but significant changes. Jason Miller's organization transformed. Intimidation tactics ceased. Business continued, but with a new operational philosophy. Rick gradually assumed more responsibilities, implementing leadership based on mutual respect rather than fear. Alexander's Barbershop remained exactly the same, a sanctuary of tradition in a quiet corner of the southwestern city. The same leather chairs, the same antique radio playing jazz, the same barber with steady hands and eyes that seemed to see beyond the evident. Only his most observant clients noticed the subtle change in his expression, a certain peace that hadn't been there before, as if he had finally closed a pending chapter of his previous life. One afternoon, months later, Jason Miller entered the barbershop for the first time. The place was empty, as if fate had arranged that private encounter. "Mr. Walker," he greeted with a nod. "Mr. Miller," Alexander responded, indicating one of the chairs. "A haircut today?" "A complete shave, if it's not too much trouble," Jason replied, sitting in the main chair. Alexander prepared his tools with the meticulous ritual that characterized all his movements. He covered Jason's face with a hot towel to open the pores, applied the shaving cream with a badger brush, and finally took his favorite razor. As he worked in silence, Jason spoke. "You know, I never properly thanked you for the shave." "I haven't finished yet," Alexander replied with a calm smile. "For showing me a different perspective," Jason clarified, "for making me see what really matters." Alexander continued his work with professional precision. "A good barber does more than cut hair, Mr. Miller. Sometimes he offers clarity." When the shave was finished and Jason was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. "My brother respects you enormously," he commented. "He says you taught him more in a week than I did in a lifetime." "Rick has potential," Alexander replied simply. "He just needed someone to see it." Jason nodded, understanding the implicit message. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller. Come back when you need another shave." The door closed softly behind him. Alexander meticulously cleaned his razor, put it away in its velvet case, and continued with his daily routine. In the golden razor, time seemed to pass at its own pace, unaware of the complications of the outside world. For those who knew his story, Alexander Walker remained an enigma. For the rest of Santa Fe, he was simply an excellent barber, with steady hands and eyes that seemed to contain stories no one dared to ask about. And that, for him, was more than enough. Dear listeners, we hope the story of the Santa Fe barber has captivated you. To continue this journey through the depths of human psychology, we've prepared a special collection with equally fascinating stories. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day we bring new narratives that explore the most interesting corners of the human soul. Don't miss our upcoming content. We'll be waiting for you in the comments to know your opinions about this enigmatic barber.